Hello everyone, Mr.G here. Welcome to my 50 subscriber special, the first part. In my second part, I'll be making one of the videos that you guys voted for. But, in this first part, I'm going to talk about the history of Mr.G and all of the characters. Most of them. The recurring ones, not the one-offs that no one ever cares about. So, without further ado, let's get into the history of Mr.G. For the longest time I wanted to be a YouTuber, but the problem was, I never knew what I wanted to do. First, I considered being a movie reviewer. That only lasted for like a day. I made one video, but I deleted it like 30 minutes later. So yeah, don't even bother looking for it. It's gone. It got 0 views. It's lost to history, and it was made on an older computer that I no longer have access to. It is therefore the definition of lost media. You're not missing much, though. It was just me sitting there rambling on about, like, oh, I love Finding Nemo so much. This is such a great movie. And is that really worth hunting down? I don't think so. And then, for the next few years, I wrestled along with other ideas for YouTube series. One idea I had was that I was going to be this guy called Mr. Random, where you never know what kind of video I was going to upload. Sometimes I might upload an animation, sometimes I might upload a review, sometimes I might upload a music video, things like that. Eventually, I realized that part of consistent channel growth is having a consistent upload pattern, so having a channel whose entire purpose is to be inconsistent probably wouldn't have been the best idea. Then there's the subject of avatars. For a while, I always thought I'd be one of those channels that uses a pre-existing character and just talks over them. Yeah. But I'm glad I didn't, because those kinds of videos tend to suck. A lot. But then, one day, I figured out a character. It's a character you all know, and his name is Mr.G. Now, Mr. G's interesting because, in terms of design, he was already kind of fully formed when I thought about him. I always pictured him as a guy with a purple tuxedo and top hat with long black hair, so design-wise, not much has changed. However, his role is what's really changed. Now, some of my older subscribers might remember that this channel used to be called Mr. Gamer, and yeah, that was originally what Mr. G was going to be short for. You see, Mr. G's backstory was originally going to be that he was a guy who, as a kid, ended up getting sucked into his video game console and ended up in the world of video games, where he was the only real person there. Eventually, I scrapped that idea, so now Mr. G kinda lives in his own simulacre of Earth. As a relic of that, Mr. G originally had cross-shaped buttons, which looked like D-pads on his shirt, but once I decided that he was no longer a video game character, guy thing, I removed them. I'm not going to mention Andrew, though, since he's a raptor. I always knew what he was going to look like. A raptor. What else could he look like? So let's move on to the next character. Catherine didn't really change much. I always wanted one of Mr. G's friends to be a girl with curly red hair. The only design choice I made to her was that she originally wore a pink sweater, but eventually I changed it to blue because I felt that blue looked better. Eric, however, he was a character whose design I struggled with for the longest time. You see, when I first came up with him, he just kind of looked like a generic nerd. You know, bowl cut, thick glasses, white coat, yeah, that kind of thing. The problem there was that his design was way too generic. As in, he literally looked like every other nerd. What would have made him special? Actually, his design had always had trouble with always looking too generic. He always had black hair, that was the only thing consistent with him. Some of the early sketches I drew of him were just a guy with generic black hair, except he had a t-shirt that said Ladies Man. You know, things like that. However, one day, I ended up creating his finalized design by complete accident, in that I wasn't even intending the design I drew to be Eric's design, but when I looked at it, I was like, this is perfect! You see, in early 2020, I drew this picture, which depicts Smokey Bear teaming up with McGruff the crime dog to arrest a deranged arsonist. And does the person they're arresting look familiar to you? Yep, this is where I finally decided Eric's design. Consider this a proto-Eric. Eric never burned anything down. So yeah, I used that design, replaced the smoke marks of camo, and that's how I finally got Eric's design. Another thing to note is that both Catherine and Eric originally had nicknames much like Mr. G. Eric was originally known as Creepy Guy, and Catherine was known as Crack Shipper. Now, during this time they still both had the names Catherine and Eric as their real names, but they were only ever referred to by their nicknames. Eventually I scrapped that because their nicknames always sounded so awkward, and I could never take them seriously when they referred to each other by their nicknames. So I decided to just use their real names. Do their nicknames still exist in universe? Maybe, but that's up for you to decide. Vincent. Now, I said earlier that Eric was probably the hardest character to come up with a design for, but Vincent is definitely a close second. Vincent is about a year younger than Mr. G in terms of creation. Mr. G was created during my later years of middle school, while Vincent was created during my first year of high school. Basically, one day, I got an idea of a kid who could transform into mythical creatures. And using his powers, he would have had to stop an evil force. He was always named Vincent, but originally, he had an amulet that had different symbols on them that allowed him to transform into what the symbols showed, but eventually I changed it to a diamond that's permanently stuck in his chest. Also, his main bad guy wasn't the Boogeyman, but rather Cthulhu. But eventually I changed that because I felt that Cthulhu was a bit too much for a main villain. Vincent originally also had the power to enter books and bring characters from books into the real world. He could travel into the worlds of books, travel from book to book, and he was originally going to be part of a posse that included several other fictional characters. But eventually I decided that Vincent would work by himself. Design-wise, I don't remember much about Vincent's early designs. I think at one point I thought about giving him brown hair, but I think blonde hair works better for the effect I'm going for with him. Plus it matches his eyes and backstory. There's also some scrapped characters too, but if you didn't watch that or if you forgot, here's a refresher. You see, I always wanted to make Mr. G's group a quadrio for some reason, I don't know why. So for the fourth member, I had several candidates. First was a grouchy old man. I never actually gave him a name, I always just called him Old Man, Grouchy Old Man, things like that. Basically, his thing was that he was incredibly old, he was a World War II veteran, he hated things that weren't American, things like that. However, eventually I ran into problems with him, namely the fact that literally every joke I could think of him had already been done on The Simpsons with their grandpa character. As such, he really struggled to stand out at all. So, he got retired. Next up was Cringe Kid, who was probably one of the worst ideas I ever had. Basically, he was a kid obsessed with whatever was considered cringy at the moment. I got rid of this character for several reasons. 1, I started to find him really annoying. 2, I had a hard time explaining why this random kid was living with people he wasn't related to. 3, making fun of cringy kids kinda died, so having him here would have just been weird. And 4, his entire shtick just would have been pop culture references, which is never a good thing for a character. And finally, there was Mr. Bad at Video Games, a character I never drew, and I never even thought of a design for him, so he's forever stuck in limbo. His entire thing was that he was bad at video games. That was it. You know how they say there's no such thing as bad ideas? Well, how about a character whose entire shtick, as in literally the only thing they do, is that you're bad at video games? I defy anyone to explain how that can be a good idea in a non-gaming show. So yeah, never drew him, he's dust now, goodbye. Well, that's all for part 1, that's all the scrapped ideas I can remember. If I see more, I'll update you. Now if you excuse me, I have a big piece of fish to fry. See you in part 2. No more, there won't be any Monsters of the Mind until part 2 is uploaded, so don't worry. Let's do this.